Clara Whitmore did not scream when they dragged her through the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon. She had already used every word she had pleading with the sheriff, begging the school board, knocking on every door on Main Street until her knuckles bled. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. A whole town of decent people stood on that dusty boardwalk and watched a woman get taken like she was worth nothing. But one man was still riding in from the hills, and Ethan Walker had never once in his life walked past a wrong he could make right. If this story moves you, subscribe. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it all began, Clara Whitmore had 47 cents in her coat pocket, a leather satchel full of arithmetic papers she still needed to grade, and not a single person in Dust Creek, Wyoming, who was willing to look her in the eye. She stood in front of the schoolhouse door, the one she had painted herself last September, the one with the little carved wooden sign that read, Dust Creek School for Children, and she read the notice they had nailed to it sometime in the night. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because the words didn't make sense on the first or the second pass. By order of the Dust Creek Municipal Banking Authority and the office of Mr. Victor Blackwood, this property is hereby declared forfeit pending investigation into the misappropriation of public education funds. All classes suspended until further notice. Clara's fingers went cold around the paper. She pulled the notice off the nail, folded it once, and put it in her satchel next to the arithmetic papers. Then she walked straight to Victor Blackwood's bank. The bank was the finest building on Main Street. 2 stories of imported brick glass windows you could actually see through a polished brass door handle that caught the morning light and threw it back in your face like a dare. Victor Blackwood had built it 12 years ago and had spent every year since making sure Dust Creek understood who the town really belonged to. Clara walked through the front door without slowing down. The clerk behind the counter, a thin young man named Perry, who Clara had taught to read 4 years ago when she was still working the schoolhouse up in Laramie, looked up and went pale. "Miss Whitmore," Perry said quietly, "I don't think you should—" "Where is he?" Clara said. It wasn't a question. Perry pointed at the door behind him, the heavy oak one with the frosted glass panel, the one that read, V. Blackwood, President. Clara walked through that door too. Victor Blackwood was seated behind a desk the size of a small barn, and he did not look surprised to see her. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Not irritated. Not caught off guard. He looked exactly like a man who had been expecting her, which meant he had already decided how this conversation was going to go. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, with silver hair. He wore combed back flat, and a suit that cost more than most families in Dust Creek made in a year. He had a way of holding himself very still, very deliberate, like a man who had learned that stillness made people nervous. It made Clara nervous too. She wasn't going to let that stop her. "That notice on the schoolhouse door," Clara said, setting the folded paper on his desk. "I want to know what it means." Victor looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "I think it's fairly clear, Miss Whitmore. It says I misappropriated funds. It says there's an investigation into the misappropriation of funds. That's a distinction worth noting." "Mr. Blackwood." Clara kept her voice level. She had learned a long time ago that a woman who raised her voice in a room like this stopped being a person with a grievance and became a problem to be managed. "I have been keeping the school accounts for 3 years. Every penny that came in and every penny that went out is recorded in ledgers that I maintain personally. There is nothing in those books that does not belong there." Victor tilted his head. "The books you maintain personally," he said very mildly. "Yes, that's rather the issue, isn't it?" Clara felt something cold move through her chest. "Excuse me. A single bookkeeper, no oversight, no independent audit." He folded his hands on the desk. "You'll understand why that raises questions. Those books are open to anyone who asks to see them. I have invited the school board to review them, 3 times in writing." "Yes, I know." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I'm the one who told them not to bother." The silence in the room was absolute. Clara stood very still and made herself breathe. "You told them," she said slowly, "not to look at the books." "I told them the matter was already under investigation, and that a formal review would be conducted at the appropriate time." He picked up a pen and turned it between his fingers, unhurried, unbothered. "That time is now. And what exactly are you investigating?" "A discrepancy of $412, Victor said, "in the construction fund for the new schoolhouse annex." Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "There is no discrepancy," she said. "That money was returned to the account in February when the lumber order came in under budget. I have the receipts. I have the bank correspondence. I can show you, Miss Whitmore." His voice was patient, the way you'd be patient with a child who kept insisting the sky was green. "I'm not here to debate the arithmetic with you. I'm here to tell you that until this matter is resolved, the school is closed, and I'd encourage you to think very carefully about how you conduct yourself over the coming days." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You're closing the school," she said. "Temporarily. Those children will find somewhere to be." He made a small gesture dismissive, the kind a man makes when he's finished a conversation and is simply waiting for the other party to realize it. "Mr. Blackwood." Clara leaned forward, both hands on the edge of his desk. "I have been in this town for 3 years. I have taught 64 children how to read. I have taught their mothers how to balance household accounts and their fathers how to write letters. I know every family from one end of Dust Creek to the other, and I know every cent that has ever passed through the school fund. And I am telling you, there is no discrepancy. What there is $412 that was supposed to go into the annex construction fund and instead went somewhere else entirely before it ever reached the school account." She held his eyes. "I think you know where it went." The stillness in the room changed. Victor Blackwood stopped turning the pen. "That's a very serious allegation," he said quietly. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Something flat and cold and entirely without mercy, and then he picked up the small brass bell on the corner of his desk and rang it once. The door behind Clara opened. 2 men came in, big men, the kind Victor Blackwood kept around specifically for moments like this one. "Miss Whitmore," Victor said pleasantly. "I think it's time you and I continued this conversation somewhere a little more public. It's important that the town understand what's happening here. For transparency's sake, you understand." Clara understood perfectly. They walked her out onto Main Street. That was how she would think about it afterward in the days when she had time to sit with the memory. They walked her out. Because that was technically accurate. She did walk under her own power. But Victor Blackwood walked on one side, and one of his men walked on the other. And the third man was already ahead of them, and by the time they reached the middle of the street, there were already 24 people stopped and watching. Dust Creek on a Thursday morning. Farmers come in for supplies. Women at the dry goods store. The barber standing in his doorway with a towel over his shoulder. Ed Colton, who ran the general store and whose daughter Clara had taught to read last winter, standing on the boardwalk with his arms crossed. Victor stopped in the center of the street and he raised his voice so the whole town could hear. "I want everyone to know," he said, "that we have a serious situation on our hands. Miss Whitmore here has been managing the school funds for 3 years without oversight. It has now come to light that $412 is missing from the school construction account." He paused, looking around, letting it land. "I think we all understand what that means." Clara looked at the faces watching her. She knew these people. She had eaten at their tables and sat with their sick children and written letters to their relatives back east on their behalf. Not one of them stepped forward. "That's not true," Clara said loudly, clearly. "Mr. Blackwood took that money himself. I have documentation." "Where is this documentation?" Victor interrupted, still pleasant, still patient. "In my room at the boarding house. In my ledger books, which you keep yourself with no independent witness to their accuracy." He looked at the crowd with an expression of genuine regret. "You see the difficulty. Ed, Clara said, turning to the man she knew. Ed Colton, you know me. You know I have never your daughter Emma. You remember last February when she was sick, and I came 3 days running to sit with her so your wife could sleep. Ed. Colton looked at the ground. Mr. Collins. She tried. Reverend Hayes. Someone. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at her. That was when Victor nodded to his men, and one of them, the one with the thick red hands and the dead eyes, took hold of Clara's arm. Miss Whitmore, Victor said. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with us while we sort this out. We'll be using the Silver Spur as a temporary holding space until the sheriff can— Get your hands off me! Clara tried to pull free. The grip tightened. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, the man said. Let go of me. She was still saying it when they walked her through the doors of the Silver Spur Saloon, and the doors swung shut behind them, and the crowd on Main Street slowly went back to their business, and nobody said a word about it. The Silver Spur smelled like sawdust and stale whiskey, and something else underneath something Clara couldn't name for a moment, and then recognized as fear, not her own, or not only her own, but the particular smell of a room that had seen a lot of people frightened in it over the years. They put her in a chair at a table near the back. The saloon was mostly empty this time of morning. A bartender polishing glasses. 2 men playing cards in the corner who looked up once and then looked away. A woman in a red dress sitting at the bar who watched Clara come in with an expression that was mostly pity. Victor sat down across from her. His 2 men stood behind him. Now then, he said, completely at ease, like they were resuming a pleasant business meeting. Let's talk about what happens next. What happens next, Clara said, is that I get my ledger books and I show you and anyone else who wants to look exactly where every penny went, and then you explain to the town why you've been lying. What happens next, Victor said, is that you accept the situation. You're a smart woman, Miss Whitmore. Smarter than most people around here. I think you and I both know that. He tilted his head. Use that intelligence now. Walk away from Dust Creek quietly. I will ensure the investigation concludes without any formal charges. You find another position somewhere else. Everyone moves on. And the school? The school will be managed by someone more suitable. Those children are not your concern anymore. Clara looked at him across the table. What are you building on that land? She said quietly. For just a fraction of a second, something moved behind his eyes. I beg your pardon. The annex land, the 3 acres the school board purchased for the new building. The lumber order came in under budget, which is why the $400 was returned to the general fund instead of staying in the construction account. I can show you the bank correspondence dated February 4th. She kept her eyes on his. That land borders the new rail survey corridor, the Denver and Pacific survey that came through in January. I've seen the maps, Mr. Blackwood. Someone with capital and early knowledge of the route could buy up a great deal of property in this area very cheaply, especially if the current owners could be pressured into selling quickly. The silence stretched. Property like the school annex land, Clara said. Or like Walker Ranch, which sits right in the middle of the proposed secondary route. Victor Blackwood looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then he said very quietly, You should not have said that. Probably not, Clara said. But it's true. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the man with the red hands and said, Make sure she doesn't leave. Then he walked to the bar and began a quiet conversation with the bartender, and Clara sat in the chair and looked at her hands on the table and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. And she was still thinking about it 20 minutes later when the doors of the Silver Spur opened and light spilled in from the street. The man who walked through them was tall, the kind of tall that registers before you have time to catalog any other detail. He stopped just inside the doorway, and Clara could see dust on his coat and on his hat and on his boots. The kind of dust that accumulates over a long ride, and his eyes were moving around the room the way a man's eyes move when he's been trained to know where the danger is before he needs that information. They settled on Clara. Then they moved to the man with the red hands standing behind her chair. Then they moved to Victor Blackwood at the bar. "Ethan Walker," Victor said without turning from his conversation, his voice carrying easily. "This doesn't concern you." "Might be you're right about that," the man said. His voice was quiet, unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer interested in debating it. "Except I just came from the street, and there are people out there who watched two men drag a woman in here, and none of them did a thing about it, and that tends to concern me." He took another step into the room. Clara looked at him. He was maybe 35, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work. Dark eyes that were entirely calm, and the kind of quiet stillness about him that she recognized from Victor Blackwood. But where Victor's stillness was the stillness of a predator, certain of its power, this was something different. This was the stillness of a man who had already accounted for every possible outcome, and was waiting for the one that was going to happen. "I said this doesn't concern you," Victor repeated. "And I said might be you're right." Ethan Walker's eyes moved back to Clara. "Ma'am, are you here of your own choosing?" Clara looked at the hand of the man behind her resting on her shoulder. She looked at Victor Blackwood. She looked at the doors, still swinging behind Ethan Walker. "No," she said clearly. "I am not." "All right then." He looked at the red-handed man. "Take your hand off the lady's shoulder." The man laughed. "And if I don't, then I'm going to have to move it for you, and I'd rather not do that if we can avoid it." The man at the bar, the second one, started moving. Ethan Walker was already moving faster. What happened in the next 30 seconds was neither dramatic nor romantic in the way that things sometimes are in stories. It was fast and efficient, and not particularly clean. The man with the red hands went down first, then the man from the bar. The bartender pressed himself against the back wall and looked at the ceiling. The two card players in the corner stood up very slowly, with their hands visible. Victor Blackwood turned from the bar and looked at Ethan Walker with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, something more calculated than either. "You just made a significant mistake," Victor said. "Reckon I've made worse." Ethan crossed the floor to Clara's table and looked down at her. "Ma'am, can you stand?" Clara looked up at him. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow that was going to need attention, and his knuckles were going to bruise. She thought about the arithmetic papers in her satchel, and the 47 cents in her pocket, and the closed door of the schoolhouse. "Yes," she said. "I can stand." "Then I'd be obliged if you'd do so and walk out that door with me." She stood. She picked up her satchel. She walked with Ethan Walker through the saloon past the man with the red hands who was sitting against the wall, deciding whether his situation was worth continuing past the woman in the red dress at the bar who gave Clara a look that said, "Good for you, honey," and meant it, and out through the swinging doors into the sunlight. The street was not empty. There were people on the boardwalk, some of the same people who had stood there an hour ago and watched her be taken in. They were watching now too, with the same careful, calculating look of people who are trying to determine which way the wind is blowing before they decide which direction to stand. Clara stopped in the middle of the street and let herself feel the sun on her face for a moment. "Your horse," Ethan said. "I don't have one. I live at Mrs. Garfield's boarding house." "Then we'll get your things from Mrs. Garfield's boarding house." "They'll be watching it." "Yes," he said. "They will." He looked at her steadily. He didn't offer any complicated plan or any reassurance, or any of the things that men in this situation sometimes offered women, things that were more about making the man feel useful than about solving the actual problem. He just waited the way a man waits when he understands that the next decision belongs to someone else. Clara thought about her ledger books, about the February bank correspondence, about the rail survey maps she had seen spread across the hotel table 3 weeks ago when she'd gone to deliver a message to a guest and found the door ajar. "The boarding house first," she said. "I need my books." "All right." "And Mr. Walker." He looked at her. "What you just did in there," she said carefully, "is going to make things considerably worse before they get better." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know that." "Victor Blackwood is not a man who lets things go." "No." Ethan said. He is not. So why? He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she thought he was going to say something about justice or decency, or what a man had to do. The kind of thing men said in situations like this that sounded fine in the saying, but didn't actually answer the question. Instead, he said, I've got land that borders the rail corridor. Blackwood's been after it for 2 years. I figure whatever you found in those books concerns me about as much as it concerns you. Clara looked at him for a moment. You heard what I said to him. Sound carries, he said. How long were you standing out there? Long enough. She adjusted her satchel on her shoulder. Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the last 5 minutes, and she wasn't entirely sure when. All right, she said. Then we'd better move quickly. Yes, ma'am, Ethan Walker said. I reckon we had. Mrs. Garfield's boarding house was 3 blocks from the Silver Spur, a 2-story white clapboard building with a porch that wrapped around the front, and a widow's walk at the top, where Clara sometimes went to think. Mrs. Garfield herself was 64 years old, had buried 2 husbands, and outlasted a cattle plague, and a drought, and a grasshopper summer that had stripped the county bare, and she had very clear opinions about how her house was to be conducted. She was standing on the porch when Clara and Ethan came up the walk, and she looked at the 2 of them at Clara's composure, and Ethan's cut forehead, and the general atmosphere of something having recently happened, and her jaw went tight. Clara Whitmore, she said. Are you all right? I'm fine, Mrs. Garfield. I heard what happened on Main Street. Her eyes moved to Ethan. Ethan Walker. I haven't seen you in town for a good while. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. There's a man watching the back alley, she said without preamble. One of Blackwood's boys. Been there about 15 minutes. Clara looked at Ethan. He didn't look surprised. I need my ledger books, Clara said, and my correspondence files, the wooden box under the bed. I'll get them, Mrs. Garfield said. You 2 go around through the kitchen and wait by the back fence. Not out back, stay in the kitchen. She gave Ethan a look that would have stopped a younger or less certain man in his tracks. You going to keep her safe? Yes, ma'am, Ethan said. See that you do? Mrs. Garfield said, and went inside. They waited in Mrs. Garfield's kitchen, which smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the remains of breakfast, and Ethan stood by the window where he could see the street, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. The ledger books were the key. She knew it. Victor Blackwood knew it. The February bank correspondence, the receipts from the lumber order, and most importantly, the copy she had made of the rail survey map, the one she had sketched from memory, the same evening she'd seen it in the hotel room. Every line and measurement she could recall the corridor, marked in red, running straight through the eastern edge of Walker Ranch. She hadn't told anyone about the map. She hadn't known what to do with it, or who to trust. How long have you known? She asked. Ethan didn't look away from the window. Known what? About the railroad. A pause. Since January, when the surveyors came through and tried to get me to sign a preliminary interest letter. Said they'd give me fair market for the eastern pasture. What did you say? Said I'd think about it. He turned from the window slightly. Didn't think about it long. Told them no. And since then? Since then, my fence line got cut twice and 2 of my calves went missing and someone shot out the window in my bunkhouse. His voice was flat informational. Nobody in town knows anything about it naturally. Victor Blackwood, Clara said. I can't prove it. I might be able to. She looked at her hands on the table. The ledger shows a payment in January, $600, marked as a consulting fee to an entity called DPC Holdings. I didn't know what it was when I recorded it. It came through the county account, so I listed it without question. But I looked it up last month. Denver and Pacific Consolidated. That's the railroad company. Victor Blackwood has been receiving payments from the railroad while simultaneously controlling the land acquisition process for this county. He's been creating legal obstacles for landowners who won't sell using his position at the bank to call in loans, manufacturing problems. She stopped. Like closing a school over missing funds that aren't missing. Ethan was looking at her now. You figured all that out from a ledger book, he said. I was a bookkeeper before I was a teacher, she said. In Boston, for a shipping company. I was very good at it. She looked back at her hands. Which is probably why someone looked at Dust Creek and thought the school account needs a keeper. And then thought better, make sure the keeper is someone controllable. I came here on a letter of recommendation from a man I later realized had business connections to DPC Holdings. She shook her head. I was meant to be window dressing. Someone who would keep records that looked clean without asking the right questions. But you asked the right questions. I always do, Clara said. It's a habit. People find it inconvenient. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across Ethan Walker's face and then settled back into the ordinary stillness. Miss Whitmore, he said, I think you may be the most dangerous person in Dust Creek right now. I know, she said. I've been trying to figure out what to do about that. Mrs. Garfield came through the kitchen door with a wooden box and set it on the table in front of Clara. Your books, she said, and your correspondence. She set a wrapped bundle on top. And some biscuits because I don't imagine either of you has eaten. Clara looked at the box. She looked at Ethan Walker by the window. She thought about 64 children who would show up at the schoolhouse door tomorrow morning and find it still locked. She thought about Victor Blackwood sitting in the Silver Spur right now, very calm, very certain making arrangements. She thought about the map she had sketched from memory, tucked in the back of her third ledger book, every line exactly as she remembered it. Mr. Walker, she said, how many days' ride is it to the county seat? Ethan considered. 3 days hard riding, 4 if the weather's bad. There's a federal territorial land office in Cheyenne. They have jurisdiction over railroad acquisition disputes. He looked at her steadily. You want to take this to Cheyenne, he said. I want to take the evidence to someone who has both the authority and the motivation to act on it, Clara said. Victor Blackwood owns this county. He doesn't own the territorial government. That's a long ride, Ethan said. Yes, it is. Victor Blackwood has friends between here and Cheyenne. Yes, he does. And we'd be leaving tonight, which means cold camp and no lights. Clara Whitmore looked at Ethan Walker across Mrs. Garfield's kitchen table, with her ledger books in front of her and a biscuit in her hand and 47 cents still in her coat pocket. Mr. Walker, she said, are you explaining the difficulties to me, or are you looking for a reason to say no? The silence held for 3 full seconds. Neither, Ethan said. He picked up his hat from the table and put it on. I'm telling you what we're riding into, so you know what you're saying yes to. Clara stood up and put the ledger books carefully in her satchel. I know what I'm saying yes to, she said. Let's go. They rode out of Dust Creek before the last light left the sky. Mrs. Garfield had given them 2 horses from her late husband's stable solid animals, not fast but steady, the kind that kept moving when everything in them wanted to stop. Clara had ridden before enough to manage, though her legs would remind her of that fact for the next several days. Ethan rode like a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it easy and economical, one hand loose on the reins. They didn't speak for the first hour. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't wait, and the dark had a quality to it that discouraged noise, the particular dark of open country, wide and deep, and full of sounds that weren't human. Clara kept her satchel across her body, the ledger books pressing against her ribs, and watched the road ahead, and tried not to think about what Victor Blackwood was doing right now in the town behind them. She thought about it anyway. He would have men on the road by morning. She knew that. He would have sent a rider to the sheriff's office already, and Sheriff Pruitt, who owed his position to Victor Blackwood and knew it, and had stopped pretending otherwise, sometime last year, would have signed whatever paper Victor put in front of him. Theft. Fraud. Something with enough legal weight to stop them on the road and bring them back. She shifted the satchel and felt the corner of the third ledger book dig into her side. The map was still in there. Every line she had sketched from memory, every measurement she had tried to hold in her head while standing in that hotel corridor, with her heart beating too fast, hoping the guest inside didn't hear her through the door. She had been meaning to make a copy, a cleaner one, something legible enough to show to someone official. She hadn't had the chance. She had to hope what she had was enough. "You're thinking too loud," Ethan said from beside her. Clara glanced at him. "I didn't say anything." "No," he said. "But you're sitting like a woman doing arithmetic in her head, and the numbers aren't coming out right." He kept his eyes on the road. "Whatever it is, it'll wait till we stop." "When are we stopping?" "Couple more hours. There's a creek crossing about 8 miles out with good tree cover. We'll camp there, be moving again before dawn." Clara did the arithmetic she'd been doing. 8 miles. Dawn. 3 days hard riding to Cheyenne and Victor Blackwood, with a head start on sending word ahead. "He'll telegraph," she said. "Probably already has," Ethan said. "Cheyenne, Laramie, every town with a wire on the route between here and there." "Then we can't take the main road the whole way." "No," he said, "we can't. You know another way." "I know the land between here and Cheyenne better than most," he said. "Spent 3 years running cattle over it before I settled. There are routes that don't have towns, which means no telegraph stations, which means nobody to wire ahead to." "How much longer does that add?" "Day, maybe day and a half." Clara felt the pressure of the ledger books against her ribs and thought about 64 children and a closed schoolhouse door. "All right," she said. They rode on. The creek was exactly where Ethan said it would be, which Clara noted, because men who said things like, "There's a creek about 8 miles out," sometimes meant there's a creek somewhere in this general area, and I'll know it when I see it. But Ethan Walker said 8 miles, and they reached the creek at 8 miles, and he'd said, "Good tree cover," and there it was, a stand of cottonwoods thick enough to block the light from any direction. He built a fire small enough that it gave off heat without throwing much light, and they ate Mrs. Garfield's biscuits, which were excellent, and drank water from the creek, and the horses drank too, and for a little while nobody said anything, and the only sounds were the creek and the cottonwood leaves moving in the wind. "Tell me about Boston," Ethan said. Clara looked up. "Why?" "Because you said you were a bookkeeper before you were a teacher, and you said it like it cost you something." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I worked for a man named Hargrove," she said. "Charles Hargrove, shipping and import. He hired me because I was good with numbers, and because he thought a woman bookkeeper would be too afraid of losing the position to ask inconvenient questions." "And you asked inconvenient questions." "Eventually." She turned the last biscuit in her hands. "He was undervaluing his import receipts to reduce his tax liability and overvaluing his inventory to secure bank loans against assets that didn't exist. It wasn't complicated fraud, really. He just assumed nobody would look closely enough." "What happened when you found it?" "I went to his business partner." She paused. "Who told Hargrove within the hour?" Ethan looked at her. "I had my wages withheld," she said. "A letter sent to my professional references calling my character into question, and a very clear message delivered through 3 separate intermediaries that Boston was no longer a city in which I was welcome to build a career. So you came west. There was a position open in Laramie. And then this one." She looked at the fire. "I genuinely thought that I was being given a fresh start. A real one. I see now that what I was being given was a role in someone else's arrangement." The fire crackled. "You said you made a copy of the map," Ethan said. "A sketch. From memory. How good is your memory?" Clara looked at him. "I memorized the entirety of the principles of commercial accounting in 12 days when I was 16, because we couldn't afford to keep the borrowed copy past the due date. My memory is excellent." Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Not quite a smile, not quite respect, some combination of the two that settled into the planes of his face and stayed there. "All right," he said. "Get some sleep. I'll take first watch." "You don't need to. Miss Whitmore." He looked at her steadily. "Get some sleep." She got some sleep. She woke in the gray before dawn to the sound of Ethan's voice, very quiet, saying her name. She was on her feet. Before she was fully conscious, her hand on the satchel, which she had kept under her head, because old habits from a Boston she'd left behind told her to. "Ryder," he said. Low. Not a whisper. A whisper carried further than a controlled breath she'd learned that from somewhere she couldn't remember where. Coming from the north, moving slow. Looking for us. Can't tell yet. She stood beside him and looked at the darkness between the trees. She could hear it now. Hoofbeats, yes, but also something else. Too irregular for a steady rider. Too slow for someone with a purpose and a direction. "He's lost," she said. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Or he wants us to think he is." The rider came through the trees and resolved into a boy no more than 16 on a gray horse that had been ridden hard and not recently rested, listing slightly in the saddle, the way young men did when they were exhausted, but too stubborn to admit it. He saw them and pulled up. For a second, nobody moved. "You're Walker," the boy said, looking at Ethan. Not a question. "I am," Ethan said. "Who are you?" "Danny Pruitt." He straightened with the particular dignity of someone who knows the name they're carrying isn't a good one and has decided to use it anyway. "Sheriff's son." The silence this produced was substantial. "Your father send you," Ethan said. "No." The boy's jaw tightened. "My father doesn't know I'm here. My father is sitting in his office signing papers Blackwood put in front of him and telling himself it's legal because it says by order of at the top." Something bitter in his voice, the kind of bitter that only grows in young people who have watched someone they respected become someone they don't recognize. "I'm here on my own." "Why?" Clara said. Danny Pruitt looked at her with the particular look of a boy who had been taught that important conversations happened between men and was currently reconsidering that teaching in real time. "Because you taught my sister to read," he said. "Last year. Ellen. She's 11, and she couldn't read her name before, and now she reads everything she can get her hands on, and she talks about your class every single day at the dinner table, and last night she was crying because someone told her the school was closed." His voice went rough at the edges. "I want to know what Blackwood did." Clara looked at the boy, the exhausted set of his shoulders, the hard line of his mouth, the horse he'd ridden through the night. "Sit down," she said. "I'll tell you." She told him. All of it. The ledger books, the DPC Holdings payment, the rail corridor, the $400 that had been moved and moved back and moved again. Through accounts Victor Blackwood controlled directly. The sketch map in the back of the third ledger. The plan to reach Cheyenne and the federal land office before Victor could close that door too. Danny Pruitt listened without interrupting, which told Clara a fair amount about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's already sent riders," he said then. "2 of them early last night before I left. I don't know which direction." "Main road?" Ethan asked. "One on the main road. Other one?" Danny frowned. "I don't know. I heard my father telling Blackwood's man that you'd take the river route if you were trying to avoid notice. He said you'd done it before." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. "Your father knows my roots," he said. "My father has been watching you for 2 years," Danny said bluntly, with the bluntness of a boy who has decided that if he's going to do a thing, he's going to do it completely. "Blackwood wanted to know your habits. My father's been reporting to him." The fire had burned down to coals by now. Ethan looked at them. "All right," he said quietly to no one in particular. "I can take you a different way," Danny said. "There's a route through the Hendersons' grazing land and then up along the North Ridge. It comes out 2 miles east of Copperfield, which is the town before the county line. From there, you're on federal territory, and Blackwood's paper doesn't mean anything." Ethan looked at the boy for a long moment. "Why?" he said again. Same word Clara had used. The question underneath it was the same too. Danny Pruitt lifted his chin. "Because my father used to be a good man," he said. "And I'm not him." They broke camp before the sky was fully light. Danny knew the land the way children know places they've spent years in. not as a map, but as a body. Instinctively, the route unfolding in front of him without hesitation. He took them east through Henderson's grazing land, skirting the fence lines, moving at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground, but controlled enough that the horses could maintain it. For a while, Clara rode beside him. "What happens when your father finds out you're gone?" she asked. "He'll figure it out eventually," Danny said. He kept his eyes on the ground ahead. "Might be a day or two. He doesn't watch me that close." A pause. "He used to, before Blackwood." Clara said nothing. She understood about the way a person could be changed by proximity to a certain kind of power. How it got in under the edges of things, reshaped the priorities, made the person you'd been seem naive or sentimental or foolish in ways that felt like wisdom until you looked back from enough distance. She thought about Charles Hargrove in Boston, who had also once been a man of some integrity, or at least had been when she first came to work for him. "Danny," she said, "when we get to Cheyenne, will you testify about what your father told you?" The boy was quiet for a moment. "Is that what it would come to?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But it might." He thought about it. She watched his face work through it, the cost of it, the weight of standing up in front of someone official and saying the words about your own father out loud, in a room full of people who would write it down. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I reckon I would." She didn't say good or thank you, or that's very brave, all of which were true, but none of which was what the moment needed. She just nodded and rode on. They were 2 hours past Henderson's fence line, moving up toward the North Ridge, when Ethan pulled his horse to a stop so sudden that Clara nearly rode past him. "What?" she started. He held up one hand. His eyes were on the ridge above them. Clara looked. She couldn't see anything, just rock and scrub pine and the ridgeline against the brightening sky. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Coming down. Not up, coming from above them, from the direction they were heading. "How many?" she said very quietly. "2," Danny said from behind them. "Maybe 3. "Blackwood's other rider," Ethan said, still quiet. The kind of quiet that a man maintains when raising his voice would cost him something. "He didn't take the main road, and he didn't take the river route. He took the ridge." "How did he know?" "He didn't," Ethan said. "He's covering all of them." He turned his horse, slightly scanning. "There's a draw about a quarter-mile east, dense scrub deep enough to take the horses. And then," Clara said, "we wait." "For how long?" His eyes moved back to the ridge. "Long enough for them to pass. If they're looking for us on a specific route, they'll move on when they don't find us on it. They're not searching the whole territory. And if they stop..." He looked at her. "Then we don't wait," he said. They took the horses into the draw. The scrub was dense and the ground soft, which meant the horses moved quietly, which was the important thing. Clara held her horse's head and kept her breathing controlled, and listened to the hoofbeats on the ridge. Get closer, and then slow, and then stop. She heard voices, too far to make out words, but she could hear the shape of them, 2 men talking, not hurrying. She heard a horse shift, the sound of one of the riders dismounting. She looked at Ethan in the dim light of the draw. He was watching the ridge above them. His right hand was at his side, not on his gun, but close. She looked at Danny. The boy had his jaw set and his horse under control, and he was doing the thing she'd seen veterans of difficult situations do. He was making himself very still and very small and waiting, because those were the things he could do, and he was doing them. She felt a sudden fierce respect for him that had nothing to do with age. The voices continued. One of the men said something that rose at the end, questioning. The other one answered shorter, definitive. The first one said something else. Then the dismounted man got back on his horse, and the hoofbeats started again, moving east along the ridge, not down toward them. They waited. The hoofbeats faded. They waited another 10 minutes, which felt like considerably more. "All right," Ethan said. They brought the horses out of the draw. They reached Copperfield at noon. It was a small town, smaller than Dust Creek, which was itself not large, with a main street of maybe a dozen buildings and a water tower and a depot for the stage line. Federal territory, as Danny had said, which meant Victor Blackwood's writ from Sheriff Pruitt was paper and nothing more beyond the county line. That didn't mean they were safe. It meant they were in a different kind of danger, which was almost better in the sense that it was a known quantity. Ethan left the horses at the livery and gave Danny money for a meal and told him to eat and rest and stay out of sight. And Danny took the money without argument, which meant he was either very tired or had developed enough good sense not to waste time on pride in a situation like this. Clara hoped it was both. She and Ethan sat in a corner of the only restaurant. The town had a narrow room with 4 tables and a woman behind the counter who brought coffee without being asked and asked no questions, which Clara thought was the best possible service she could imagine right now. She spread the third ledger book open on the table and found the sketch in the back. In the daylight, in a room with no pressure and no one's footstep outside the door, she could see that it was better than she'd feared and not as good as she'd hoped. The main corridor lines were clear. The measurements she'd held in her head were right, she was certain of that. But the secondary spur, the one that ran through the eastern edge of Walker Ranch, the one that was the whole reason Victor Blackwood wanted Ethan's land. She'd been rushed when she sketched that part, and the scale was off in a way that a lawyer could pick at. "It's the eastern spur," she said. "The line I drew is right, but the distance markers are off. Maybe 10%. Off how? The spur comes closer to your property line than I marked it. Maybe 100 yards closer." Ethan looked at the sketch. He was quiet for a moment. 100 yards closer means the spur doesn't just touch the eastern pasture, he said. It cuts through the middle of it. Yes. Which means the railroad can't be built without acquiring that section outright. Yes. Which means Blackwood doesn't just want to buy me out, Ethan said. He needs to. The railroad deal can't go through without my land specifically. That's what I think, Clara said. He leaned back in his chair. His coffee sat untouched. How much is the railroad paying him? He said. The ledger shows $600 in January, she said. But that was a consulting fee. The acquisition commission on property in the rail corridor, if he's brokering the sale of every parcel between here and the county line. She did the arithmetic quickly. 15,000, maybe more, depending on what he negotiates. Ethan looked at the ceiling. And the school land, he said. The 3 acres. Right in the secondary spur corridor, Clara said. If the school board transfers it for unpaid debts, which is what the fraud allegation against me was meant to manufacture, it goes into the county asset pool which Victor controls through the bank. Clean, Ethan said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite disgust, but was somewhere in the territory between them. The man is thorough. He's been planning this for at least 2 years, Clara said. Probably longer. She closed the ledger. The sketch isn't enough on its own, she said. The land office will need the original survey, and testimony about the payments, and someone with standing to file the dispute. I have standing, Ethan said. It's my land. And I have the ledger, she said. But we need someone who can confirm where the money went after it left the county account. She was thinking about this, turning it around in her head, looking at the shape of it, when the restaurant door opened and Danny Pruitt came in, and by the set of his shoulders, she knew immediately that something had happened. He sat down across from them without being invited. There's a man at the telegraph office, he said without preamble, sending a wire. I saw the address on the outgoing message board when I walked past. He looked at Ethan. It's addressed to a Judge Harlan Cole, in Cheyenne. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Cole is the territorial land court judge, she said. He's also a member of the Cheyenne Commercial Development Association, Ethan said, with the voice of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping not to confirm, which has 2 major investors. Let me guess, Clara said. Victor Blackwood, he said, and the Denver and Pacific Consolidated. The coffee cooled on the table between them. It wasn't just the routes that Blackwood controlled. Clara understood. It wasn't just the sheriff, the school board, the county accounts. He'd gone further up the chain. The man they were riding to in Cheyenne, the man with the authority to act on what they brought him, was already in Victor Blackwood's pocket. "Is there another judge?" she said. "Not in the territory with jurisdiction over land disputes," Ethan said. "Cole's the only one." "Federal," Danny said. Both of them looked at him. "If it's railroad land acquisition," he said with the slightly defensive certainty of someone who has read more than people expect, "doesn't the federal government have jurisdiction, not just the territory?" Clara looked at him. Then she looked at Ethan. "The Federal Land Commissioner," she said slowly, "in Washington, but there's a regional office." "Denver," Ethan said, sitting up straighter. "Denver," Clara said. "Not Cheyenne, not the territorial court at all." She felt something shift, not hope exactly, something more structural than that, a load-bearing wall that had looked damaged turning out to be sound. The Denver and Pacific is a federally chartered railroad. Any land acquisition dispute involving a federally chartered carrier falls under federal jurisdiction, not territorial. "Which means Cole has no authority over it," Ethan said. "None whatsoever," Clara said. "And whatever wire Victor just sent him doesn't matter." The three of them sat with that for a moment. "Denver is farther than Cheyenne," Danny said. "Yes," Ethan said. "It's also a city where Victor Blackwood doesn't have 20 years of relationships built," Clara said. "The Regional Federal Land Office has a commissioner who is appointed by the Interior Department, not elected by Wyoming voters." She closed the ledger book and put it back in her satchel. "Denver." Ethan looked at her. "That's a week's hard riding from here," he said. "I know. And Blackwood will figure out what we're doing. He'll have men going the same direction within a day, once he knows we're not heading to Cheyenne." "I know that too." "And the sketch map you have is what it is," Clara said. "And the ledger is what it is. And Danny's testimony is what it is. And your testimony about the survey and the pressure and the property damage is what it is." She met his eyes. "Mr. Walker, I was run out of Boston with nothing. I arrived in Wyoming with 47 cents and a set of good ledger books and a job that turned out to be a trap. I have spent 3 years building something in Dust Creek that mattered to people, and Victor Blackwood closed it in a morning." She picked up the satchel and set it on her shoulder. "I am not stopping at Cheyenne." Ethan Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up. He put on his hat. He left money on the table for the coffee. "We'll need better horses for a week's ride," he said. "The ones Mrs. Garfield gave us are good animals, but they're not built for distance." "How much will that cost?" "More than 47 cents. "I have the school account emergency fund," Danny said. Both of them looked at him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope and put it on the table. $206. I took it from the lockbox in my father's desk before I left." He held their eyes. "It belongs to the school. I figure using it to save the school counts." Clara looked at the envelope. She thought about the ledger entry in February. The lumber order, the $412, every number she had recorded for 3 years in a hand so clean and careful you could read it by lamplight at any hour. "Yes," she said. "I reckon it does." She picked up the envelope. She put it in her coat pocket next to the 47 cents, which she had not spent and did not intend to spend because she had carried it from Boston and it was hers and she intended to keep it. "Let's go buy horses," Ethan Walker said, and they went. They bought 3 horses with Danny's money and were out of Copperfield before the afternoon sun peaked. The horses were better a dark bay for Ethan, a roan for Clara, and a sturdy gray for Danny that had more endurance than elegance, which suited the boy just fine. Ethan had negotiated without wasting words, paid without haggling past what was fair, and moved them out of the livery with the particular efficiency of a man who understood that time spent standing still was time spent losing ground. Clara had used the 10 minutes at the livery to re-examine the ledger sketch. She'd found something she hadn't noticed the first time, a notation in the margin of the original survey entry, small and faint, that she'd made the night she first saw the railroad maps and hadn't fully processed. 3 letters. T-C-O. She'd written them automatically the way you write things when your hand is moving faster than your brain. And then the hotel door had shifted, and she'd run, and she'd never gone back to think about what they meant. She was thinking about them now. TCO. She rode beside Ethan for an hour before she said it out loud. Does the name Transcontinental Charter Office mean anything to you? He thought about it. It's a federal body, oversees land grants for rail expansion, sits under the Interior Department. Would it have jurisdiction over acquisition disputes? More than the regional land office, he said. Why? She told him about the notation. He listened without interrupting, which she had already come to understand was his way. He didn't fill silences with sound, didn't ask questions before he had the shape of the thing you were telling him. He waited until you were finished, and then he said the thing that mattered. If the TCO has a charter record for the Denver and Pacific Spur Line, he said, it would have the original survey on file. The real one, Clara said. Not whatever Victor Blackwood is using in his land documents. If the official survey shows the spur cutting through my eastern pasture, then the fraudulent land documents Blackwood filed with the county, the ones that describe the corridor as passing around your property, are federal crimes, Clara said. Not just territorial ones. The distinction mattered enormously, and they both knew it. Territorial crimes stayed inside Victor Blackwood's web of relationships and obligations, and 20 years of carefully cultivated debt. Federal crimes went somewhere else entirely. Denver, Ethan said. And then Washington if we need to go that far, Clara said. Let's try Denver first, he said. They made good time through the afternoon and into the early evening. Danny rode behind them mostly in silence, the way young people do when they are processing something large, not sulking, just containing it, turning it over, finding its edges. Clara watched him in her peripheral vision and thought about what it cost a 16-year-old boy to decide that his father was wrong and act on that decision in the dark of night with no guarantee of what came next. She had been 22 when she made that decision about Hargrove. It had cost her Boston and a career and 3 years of her life. Danny Pruitt was 16 and had done it alone in one night. She was going to tell him that eventually, when there was room for it. They stopped at dusk near a dry riverbed where the ground was flat enough to sleep on, and there was enough distance from the road that a fire the size of Ethan's careful hand wouldn't be seen. They ate the last of what Mrs. Garfield had packed, and Ethan produced jerky from his saddlebag that was tough enough to cause a man genuine discomfort but nutritionally adequate, and Danny ate 3 pieces without complaint and fell asleep sitting up against his saddle almost immediately afterward. Ethan watched him and something moved briefly across his face. "How old is your youngest hand?" Clara asked. He looked at her. 17, he said. "Why?" "Because you just made the face of a man who's used to looking out for someone young and does it automatically." He was quiet for a moment. "I hire young men who don't have much else," he said. "Boys who came off the trail drives with no place to land. Give them work and room and board while they figure out what they want to do next." He paused. "It's not charity. They work hard." "I know it's not charity," Clara said. "You don't seem like a man who does things because they look a certain way." He looked at the coals of the fire. "I was 17 when I started cattle driving," he said. "Nobody gave me a reason to stop and stay put until I was 30 and decided to make one myself." "Is that when you bought the ranch?" "Built it," he said. "Bought the land and built the house and the bunkhouse and the barn over 2 years." A pause. "My father told me once that a man wasn't worth anything until he'd made something that would outlast him. I used to think that was about money. And now," he looked at the sleeping boy, "now I think it's about people," he said. "What you leave in them, what you helped them become." The fire gave off the last of its warmth. Clara pulled her coat closer and thought about 64 children in a schoolhouse that was locked and dark right now with a notice on the door, and thought about what it meant to be a person whose work lived in other people's capacity to do things they couldn't do before you came along. "We're going to get those books back to them," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Ethan didn't say yes or I know or any of the other useless things a person could say in that moment. He just looked at her in the way he had, steady and direct without performance, and nodded once. That was enough. She woke to Ethan's hand on her shoulder 2 hours before dawn. Not urgent, just firm, the hand of a man who understood the difference between waking someone who needed time and waking someone who needed to be awake now. "Someone's been at the horses," he said. Clara was upright before the sentence ended. The horses were 20 feet away, tied to a line Ethan had run between 2 scrubby trees. The bay and the roan were still but the gray. Danny's gray was moving, dancing sideways against the tie line with the agitated energy of an animal that has smelled or sensed something that its instinct classifies as wrong. Ethan already had his rifle. Danny was awake too, on his feet, hand on the knife at his belt that Clara hadn't noticed until this moment. They stood still and listened. The sound came from the east. Not hoofbeats, something slower and more deliberate. The sound of a person moving carefully in the dark, who thought they were being quiet. "One person," Ethan said very low. "Could be an animal," Danny breathed. "Could be," Ethan said. He didn't sound like he thought it was. He handed Clara the rifle and picked up the handgun from where it had been resting against his saddlebag and moved into the dark without making a sound, in a way that Clara found simultaneously impressive and alarming. She held the rifle and watched the direction the gray horse was still watching, and kept her breathing even. Danny moved up beside her. "You know how to use that?" he whispered. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and she heard in the word all the bravado of a boy who is frightened and is using competence to manage it, which was, she thought, probably the right instinct. A minute passed, then 2. The gray horse settled. Ethan came back out of the dark. "Kid," he said. "Maybe 14, sleeping under a rock shelf about 40 yards east. Looks like he's been out here a while." Clara lowered the rifle. "Sleeping, deeply, and alone." He took the gun back and holstered it. "He's got a Dust Creek school book in his coat pocket." She stared at him. "One of my school books?" "Your name's written on the inside cover." Clara was already walking toward the east. The boy was named Peter Walsh, and he was 13, not 14, small for his age. His mother always said, though he'd stopped telling people that because it wasn't the thing to say. He woke up with Clara crouching beside him and Ethan Walker standing 3 feet away, and made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a word, and pressed himself back against the rock shelf before he realized who was looking at him. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Peter Walsh," she said. "What on God's earth are you doing out here?" He pulled himself together with visible effort. "Following you," he said. "I can see that. Why?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a letter handwritten on Victor Blackwood's personal stationery. She recognized the embossed letterhead, and it was addressed to someone named R. Cole. Not Harlan Cole. R. Cole. She read it twice and felt something very cold move through her. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Mr. Blackwood's office," Peter said. He sat up straighter with the particular dignity of a child who has done something that frightened him and is now going to tell you about it without diminishing it. "I go in every morning to sweep. He leaves early sometimes. Yesterday he left before I got there, and he left papers on his desk, and I know I wasn't supposed to read them, but I saw your name, and—" He stopped. "I took it because I thought you should have it." Clara read the letter a 3rd time. Then she handed it to Ethan. The letter was addressed to Robert Cole, a name she didn't know, not the judge, someone else, and it was an instruction. Clean and direct, the way Victor Blackwood did everything. The woman has documentation. The documentation must not reach Denver. Use whatever means are necessary. The matter is to be resolved before the county line. Whatever means are necessary. Ethan read it. His face didn't change, but something in the air around him did. "He's not just sending riders to stop us," Clara said very quietly. "No," Ethan said. "He's not." Danny looked at the letter over Ethan's shoulder and went still. "Who's Robert Cole?" Clara asked. "Cole Brothers," Ethan said. Robert and James. They run private security work for mining and rail companies. They're not—" He paused, choosing the word. "They're not men you send to talk." The fire was out. The dark was absolute around them. Somewhere to the east, a boy had been sleeping under a rock shelf with a schoolbook in his coat because he'd followed 2 adults and a teenager across 40 miles of Wyoming territory in the dark, with nothing but the conviction that his teacher needed this piece of paper. Clara looked at Peter Walsh. "How did you follow us?" she said. "We weren't on the main road." "I know Mr. Walker's land," Peter said. "My dad's place is 3 miles from his fence line. I know which way he goes when he doesn't want to be on the main road." He said this without any triumph, just as a fact, the way children state things that are obvious to them. Ethan looked at the boy with an expression that took Clara a moment to interpret. It was the same expression he'd worn when he talked about his young ranch hands, that quiet, involuntary recognition of a particular kind of courage in someone young. "All right," Ethan said. "He rides with us." "I'm not sending him back alone," Clara said. "No," Ethan agreed. "We're not." 4 riders instead of 3. A 13-year-old boy and a 16-year-old and a schoolteacher and a rancher moving through pre-dawn Wyoming with a letter in Clara's satchel that said someone had been contracted to stop them by any means necessary before the county line. They had already crossed the county line. Clara pointed this out. "Robert Cole doesn't do careful reading," Ethan said. "He does what he's paid to do until someone tells him to stop." "How do we make someone tell him to stop?" "We get to Denver. That's 3 days. Then we move faster." They moved faster. Ethan set a pace that was hard on the horses and harder on the riders, and absolutely necessary, and nobody complained, not Danny, not Peter, not Clara, whose legs had moved past aching into a kind of numb endurance she suspected she would be repaying for a week. They stopped for water when they had to, and not otherwise, and Ethan navigated by landmarks that Clara couldn't always identify. And by noon, they had covered more ground than she would have thought possible. Then they stopped on the ridge, and Ethan held up one hand, and everyone stopped breathing. Below them on the road that ran through the valley, 2 men were riding, moving slow, scanning. "Cole," Danny said, barely audible. "Can't tell from here," Ethan said. "What do they look like?" Clara said. "Professional," he said, which told her what she needed to know. They watched the 2 riders move through the valley below. One of them stopped and looked up at the ridge. Not at them specifically, just at the ridge. The way a man looks when he's scanning for movement. Clara made herself completely still. Beside her, Peter Walsh didn't breathe. The man looked away. Both riders continued down the valley road. They waited 20 minutes. Ethan counted them out in his head. She could see it in his face, the steady internal clock of a man who understood that patience and haste were not opposites. They were tools, and you used the right one at the right moment. "We drop into the next valley and move parallel to them," he said. "There's a ranch at the far end, the Morrisons. Good people. We can rest the horses there for an hour." "You know them," Clara said. "Jim Morrison ran cattle with me for a season. He'll help." They moved. The Morrison Ranch was modest and clean, a family operation with a garden out front that was still showing the last of the summer tomatoes, and a woman on the porch who saw Ethan Walker riding in and called back into the house before she came down the steps, which meant Jim Morrison was already at the fence line by the time they reached it. He was a compact man with a broad face and calloused hands, and the particular ease of someone who has worked a piece of land long enough that it belongs to them in the way nothing else does. "Ethan," he said. "Jim," Ethan said. "I've got a situation." "I can see that," Jim Morrison said, looking at Clara and the 2 boys. "Come in." They watered the horses and let them rest, and Jim Morrison's wife, a woman named Margaret, who had the brisk competence of someone who made quick assessments and acted on them without delay, produced food and coffee and a wash basin, and asked no questions at all for the first 15 minutes, which Clara thought was an extraordinary quality in a person. Then Margaret Morrison sat down across from Clara and said, "What do you need?" Clara told her. "The shape of it, the school, the ledger, Victor Blackwood, Robert Cole, Denver," She didn't dress it up or pad it with explanation. The woman in front of her didn't need it. Margaret listened. Her face went through several things. Anger recognition, something that might have been grim satisfaction at having a suspicion confirmed. Blackwood's been buying land all around this county for a year, she said. Offered Jim twice for the South Field. Jim said no both times. Has anything happened since? Clara said. Margaret and Jim exchanged a look. Lost a water source, Jim said from where he was standing by the door. Well dried up in March. Might be natural, might not. The room was quiet for a moment. I need you to write that down, Clara said. Date what happened, what Blackwood said to you when he made the offers. Both conversations. She looked at Jim and then Margaret. If you're willing. We're willing, Margaret said before Jim could answer, and he nodded once in agreement. Clara opened the ledger book on the table and passed it across with a pencil. While Jim Morrison wrote, she sat with her coffee and thought. She had the ledger. She had the bank correspondence. She had the sketch map. She had Peter's letter, the most dangerous document in the satchel, the one that was a confession from Victor Blackwood himself that he had contracted violence. She had Danny's testimony about his father. She now had Jim Morrison's written account of coercive land pressure. The case was getting heavier. Better. More solid. But Robert Cole was still somewhere on the road between here and Denver, and she had a 13-year-old boy who had followed her 40 miles in the dark. Peter, she said. He looked up from where he'd been sitting in the corner, eating the sandwich Margaret had given him with the focused devotion of a child who hasn't eaten properly in a day. I need you to think carefully, she said. Do you understand what that letter means, the one you brought me? He nodded. Then you understand that Robert Cole is not going to talk to us, she said. He's going to try to stop us. And I can't. She stopped. I need you to be somewhere safe. I'm not going back, he said immediately. Peter, I'm not. He put down the sandwich, which told her how serious he was, because he was clearly very hungry. You think I don't know what Blackwood will do if I go back and he finds out I took that letter? You think I can go home and pretend I don't know what I know? He looked at her with 13-year-old eyes that were very old right now. I'm not going back, Miss Whitmore. She looked at him. She thought about what she was going to say, and then she thought about what was actually true, and the two things weren't exactly the same. What was true was that Peter Walsh was 13 years old and had taken a letter from a powerful man's desk and ridden 40 miles in the dark because he believed it mattered, and that the road ahead of them had men on it who had been paid to make sure they didn't reach Denver. What was also true was that sending him back alone was not safer than keeping him with them. All right, she said. Margaret Morrison put her hand briefly on Clara's arm, a small gesture that communicated something larger. You're doing the right thing. It's a hard road. Keep going, and then stood up and went to pack them food for 3 more days. Jim Morrison walked them to the horses and pulled Ethan aside, and Clara watched them talk in low voices for 2 minutes. Ethan's face didn't change, which she had learned was not the same as him receiving neutral information. When Jim went back to the house, she said, What? Cole's been to Morrison's neighbor, Ethan said. This morning, asking about travelers, specifically a woman with a satchel and a man on a dark bay horse. How close? 3 miles east. So he knows we were on this route. He knows we were somewhere in this general direction, Ethan said. He doesn't know about the Morrison connection. He'll figure it out. He'll figure out a lot of things, Ethan said. Eventually. The question is, how fast? Clara looked at the dark bay horse. Then she looked at her own roan. Then she looked at Jim Morrison's barn and had a thought. Trade, she said. Ethan looked at her. Robert Cole is looking for a woman on a roan horse and a man on a dark bay, she said. If we change the horses, Jim won't be able to spare horses for a week, Ethan said, but he was already calculating she could see it. He doesn't have to spare them, Clara said. We trade. He keeps the roan and the bay for the week, and we take 2 of his horses and bring them back from Denver. He'd be short-handed. Margaret rides, Clara said. She had absolutely no idea if this was true. She had seen Margaret Morrison in 10 minutes of interaction, and she was making a judgment call. Ethan went back to Jim Morrison. 5 minutes later, he came back with a brown mare and a spotted gelding. "She rides better than him," he said. Clara allowed herself exactly 1 second of satisfaction. "Let's go," she said. They moved in pairs after that. Ethan and Peter ahead, Clara and Danny behind, with enough distance that at a glance they would register as 2 separate pairs of riders rather than one group of 4. It was the kind of precaution that felt excessive until it didn't. Danny rode beside her and didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "My father's going to know by now." "Probably," Clara said. "He's going to be angry." "Yes, and scared," Danny said. "He's going to be scared because he knows what Blackwood does to people who let things go wrong." A pause. "He's not a bad man. He made choices," Clara said carefully. "That's different from being bad." "Is it?" She thought about Hargrove in Boston, about the way a man could start with small compromises and not notice for a long time how far they'd walked him from where he began. "Yes," she said. "I think it is. I think it matters whether a person can look at the choices they made and understand what they cost." "He understands," Danny said quietly. "He just doesn't know what to do about it." "Maybe after this," Clara said. "He will." Danny looked at the horizon. "Do you actually believe that?" he said. She thought about whether to give him the comfortable answer. "I believe it's possible," she said. "That's what I actually believe." He nodded. Not happy, not satisfied, but accepting it as the real thing which it was. They rode on. The ambush came at a narrow pass between 2 rocky outcroppings 2 hours before nightfall. It came the way real things came, not announced, not dramatic in its opening, just suddenly and completely there. One moment the road was open, and the next moment 2 riders came out of the rocks on either side, and Clara heard Ethan shout, "Stop!" At the same moment she was already pulling the brown mare to a halt and reaching for the rifle in the scabbard at her knee. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice came from the right. A man she didn't know, heavy through the shoulders, a face that had been rearranged by previous violence into something irregular and permanent. "You need to come with me." Robert Cole. She was certain of it without being told. "I don't believe I do," she said. That wasn't a request. Ethan had put himself between Cole and Clara without appearing to move. She wasn't sure when he'd done it. Sometime in the fraction of a second between stop and now, the dark bay had become the brown mare, and he was simply there between them. "Robert," Ethan said. Cole looked at him. Something moved in his face. Recognition calculation. The assessment of a man who makes his living evaluating threats. "Walker," he said. "This doesn't have to include you." "It already does," Ethan said. "Blackwood's not paying me to deal with you." "Then don't," Ethan said. "Right away. Take your man and go." His voice was quiet, completely without anger. "I'm asking you to make the right choice here, Robert. Not for me. For yourself." Cole looked at him for a long moment. The second rider on the left, younger, less certain, was watching Cole's face the way a man watches a weather vane. "That woman has a letter," Cole said. "You know what's in it." "I know exactly what's in it," Ethan said. "If that letter gets to Denver." "It's going to Denver," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "I have a ledger with 3 years of financial records," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt the way her voice always got when she was doing arithmetic under pressure. "I have bank correspondence documenting fraudulent fund transfers. I have a survey sketch. I have written statements from property owners describing coercive acquisition practices. And I have a letter signed by Victor Blackwood authorizing the use of whatever means necessary to stop me." She looked at Robert Cole. "All of that is going to Denver. And if something happens to me on this road, this boy," she indicated Danny without looking away from Cole, "knows every word I've just said, and so does Peter Walsh, and so does Jim Morrison, and I suspect the Morrison family knows which direction we were traveling when we left their ranch this morning." She let that sit. "You're not stopping a document anymore," she said. "You're stopping a record that exists in 6 different people's knowledge. You can't make all of us disappear." Robert Cole's face was very still. "Blackwood won't stop," he said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was something closer to a warning. "Neither will I," Clara said. "We have that in common." A long silence. The second rider had stopped watching Cole's face. He was watching Clara. Then Cole turned his horse. A single motion, deliberate. He looked at his companion and tipped his head east, the direction they'd come from, and the younger man didn't hesitate. They rode back through the outcropping and out of sight. Peter Walsh let out a breath that he'd been holding so long it came out in a rush. Danny said, "Did that actually just—" "Don't," Ethan said. And they all went quiet, because it wasn't over and it wasn't safe, and they still had 2 days to Denver, and Robert Cole might come back, and they all understood this without needing to say it. Clara loosened her grip on the rifle. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with the detached interest of a woman who had been frightened before, and knew that the shaking came after, when the body finally understood what the mind had been managing, and that it meant you were fine. It meant you had gotten through the thing, and the shaking was just the cost of the passage. "Let's keep moving," she said, and they did. They rode hard through the night and didn't stop until the horses demanded it. Ethan chose the stopping place, a hollow off the road, where the ground was flat and the wind cut less, and nobody coming along the main route would see them unless they were specifically looking. He didn't explain his choices, Clara had noticed. He made them and moved, and the rightness of them became apparent afterward, which was a quality she associated with people who had spent enough time in hard situations to stop narrating and start acting. Robert Cole had not come back. That was either very good, or it meant he'd gone to get more men, and she couldn't tell which, and spending energy trying to determine it was a waste she couldn't afford. She had 2 days to Denver. That was the number that mattered. She sat with the satchel on her lap and the third ledger book open to the sketch and went through it again in the firelight. Ethan sat across from her, not watching her work, but aware of her, the way he was always aware of everything around him, that quality of comprehensive attention that wasn't anxious, just present. Danny was asleep. Peter had lasted 40 more minutes past Danny before going horizontal and not moving. "Tell me about the eastern pasture," Clara said without looking up. Ethan didn't ask why. He'd stopped asking why when she asked questions. 60 acres, he said. "Best grass on the property. I run 60 head there in the summer. There's a creek that runs through the middle of it from the hills, doesn't dry up even in August, which is rare. That's what makes the land worth something." He paused. "That and what's under it." She looked up. "Coal," he said. "Small seam not worth mining commercially, but it's there. I've known about it for 4 years, kept it to myself." "Why?" "Because a man with coal on his land becomes a different kind of target than a man without it," he said. "And I've had enough of being a target." Clara looked at him. "Does Blackwood know?" she said. "He didn't when he started pushing. He might have figured it out since." Ethan's expression was quiet and measured the face of a man doing a reckoning. "The railroad needs the land regardless. The corridor has to go through that section. The geography doesn't give them another option. But if they know about the coal, the acquisition price goes up considerably." "Or the urgency goes up," Clara said. "They need to acquire it before you can make a legal claim on the mineral rights." Which would explain why Blackwood stopped sending polite offers and started cutting my fences. The fire crackled between them. Clara looked down at the sketch, then back at Ethan. "You never told anyone about the coal," she said. "No." "Not even your hands?" "No." She thought about that. A man sitting on 4 years of kept silence on a piece of knowledge that could change his situation entirely, choosing not to use it because using it would change the nature of the danger he was in. The discipline of that. The patience. "Tell the TCO," she said. "When we get to Denver. Tell them about the coal. It changes the case. It confirms motive, she said. And it changes the federal interest in the land classification. Coal-bearing land under a federal rail corridor has specific legal protections that regular grazing land doesn't. It makes Blackwood's fraud not just a property crime, but a federal mineral rights violation. She held his eyes. It makes them care more. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I was trying to stay simple, he said. I know, Clara said. Simple is over. He looked at the fire. Yeah, he said. I reckon it is. Denver announced itself the way cities did from a distance, a smell before a sight, a density in the air, the sense of accumulated human effort pressing outward into the surrounding land. Clara had not been in a city since Boston, and the feeling of it hit her with a physical force she hadn't anticipated the noise. The movement, the sheer volume of people existing simultaneously in one space. She held it together. She always held it together. That was what she did. They came into the city in the mid-morning of the third day, road-worn and underslept and carrying more evidence than any of them had started with. The brown mare and the spotted gelding had earned a long rest. Peter Walsh had developed a blister on his right hand from the reins that he hadn't mentioned until this morning, which Clara had only discovered because she'd seen him wince when he adjusted his grip and she'd made him show her, and then she'd wrapped it with cloth from the hem of her petticoat without discussion. You should have told me, she said. It wasn't that bad, he said. Peter. I didn't want to slow things down. She'd looked at him, this 13-year-old boy, who had ridden 3 days with a blistered hand without saying a word, and felt something press against the inside of her ribs that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite pride, and was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. Next time, she said, you tell me. Yes, ma'am, he said, and she heard in those 2 words the same inflection she used herself unconsciously in the moments when she was acknowledging something she meant to do, and also wasn't entirely sure she would. They left the horses at a livery on the west side of the city with money for their feed and the instruction that Jim Morrison's brown mare and spotted gelding were to be held for collection, and then they walked. The Transcontinental Charter Office was on Federal Street, a building that communicated the seriousness of the federal government's investment in looking serious. Stone facade. Brass fittings, a seal above the door that Clara knew meant something precise and important about jurisdiction. And she used the walk from the livery to explain it to Danny and Peter, because knowing what a thing meant made you less afraid of it. And she had been a teacher for 3 years, and she did it automatically. Ethan listened to her explain it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You're going to be a very good lawyer someday. She looked at him. I'm a teacher, she said. You're both, he said, and walked through the door. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with the harried look of someone managing more paper than one person was built to manage, and he looked at the 4 of them, dusty, road-worn. 2 of them visibly underage, with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained within it the specific skepticism reserved for people who arrived at federal offices looking like they'd slept outdoors, which they had, repeatedly. I need to speak with the Regional Land Commissioner, Clara said. Do you have an appointment? No, she said. I have evidence of a federal charter violation, fraudulent land acquisition documents filed in Wyoming territory, and a letter from the party responsible for the fraud authorizing what I believe constitutes a federal threatening offense. She put the satchel on the desk. And I have traveled 6 days to get here, so I would appreciate it if you would tell the commissioner that Clara Whitmore of Dust Creek, Wyoming, is in the building and would like 15 minutes of his time. The clerk looked at the satchel, then at Clara, then at Ethan, then at Danny and Peter. He stood up and went through the door behind him without another word. Peter Walsh beside her exhaled. You're terrifying, Danny said with something in his voice that was entirely admiring. I'm prepared, Clara said. It looks the same from the outside, but it's a different thing. The door behind the desk opened again, and the clerk said, Commissioner Aldridge will see you now. Send. Commissioner William Aldridge was 60 years old and had the broad, patient face of a man who had spent 4 decades looking at land maps and listening to disputes and had developed the particular quality of stillness that came from understanding that most problems, given enough information and enough time, revealed their own solutions. He looked at Clara and Ethan and the 2 boys who had come in behind them and gestured at the chairs in front of his desk. "Sit down," he said. "All of you. Someone get those young men water." The clerk produced water. Peter drank his in one long, continuous motion. Clara set the satchel on the commissioner's desk and opened it. She laid out the contents and ordered the ledger books first opened to the relevant entries. The bank correspondence in chronological sequence. The DPC Holdings payment record. Jim Morrison's written statement. The sketch map. She set the sketch map to one side because she wanted to save it. Then she set down the letter Peter Walsh had taken from Victor Blackwood's desk. Commissioner Aldridge read it without picking it up. His face went through several things quietly, the way experienced men's faces did when they were processing something that confirmed what they'd been half suspecting. "The boy took this," he said, looking at Peter. "Yes, sir," Peter said. "From Blackwood's desk." "Yes, sir." "Were you authorized to be in that office?" "I sweep it every morning," Peter said. "He leaves the door unlocked." Aldridge looked at the letter for another moment. Then he looked at Clara. "Walk me through the ledger," he said. She walked him through it. Every entry, every discrepancy, every line that connected to the next. She had done this in her head on the road, and she did it now the way she had always done arithmetic, cleanly, without ornamentation, each number leading to the next. The story of it emerging from the numbers themselves, rather than from any emphasis she placed on them. Aldridge listened. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and she answered each one precisely. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The Eastern Spur Survey," he said. "You have a sketch." "From memory," she said. "The original will be in your charter records." He looked at her. Then he turned to the clerk in the doorway and said, "Pull the Denver and Pacific Consolidated Charter file. The survey records for the Wyoming Secondary Spur." The clerk disappeared. Aldridge looked at Ethan. "Walker Ranch," he said. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "You've owned it how long?" 7 years. Built it myself." "And the mineral survey?" Ethan looked at Clara. She gave him a small nod. "There's a coal seam under the eastern pasture," Ethan said. "Small. I found it 4 years ago. I never filed a formal claim because I didn't want the attention." He paused. "I understand that was a mistake." Aldridge's expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention sharpened. "A coal-bearing parcel in the secondary spur corridor," he said slowly to himself. "Which would make the acquisition not just a land dispute," Clara said, "but a federal mineral rights matter." "Yes, it would," Aldridge said. He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Whitmore, in your 3 years keeping these accounts, did you ever observe any communication between Victor Blackwood and anyone in the territorial government?" "Yes," she said. "Judge Harlan Cole." Aldridge went very still. "You're certain?" he said. "I have a ledger entry for December of last year," she said, reaching for the first ledger. "Payment to HEC Consultants, $60, monthly. I didn't know what it was when I recorded it. I looked it up in February. Harlan Edwin Cole." She looked at the commissioner. "He's been on Blackwood's payroll for at least 8 months." The room was quiet. Then Aldridge said, "That's why you didn't go to Cheyenne." "That's why we didn't go to Cheyenne," she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a man revising his understanding of who he was looking at. The clerk came back through the door with a large rolled document and set it on the desk. Aldridge unrolled it. It was the original Denver and Pacific Consolidated Survey for the Wyoming Secondary Spur. Detailed, precise surveyor's notations in the margins, the corridor clearly marked in red ink. Aldridge put Clara's sketch beside it. He looked at them for 30 seconds. Looked at her. "Your memory," he said, "is exceptional." "Yes?" she said. "I know." He reached for the document and traced the red corridor line with one finger, following it east through the territory until it reached the section marked Walker in the property index at the bottom. The spur didn't touch the eastern boundary of Walker Ranch. It cut through the center. "The land documents Blackwood filed with the county," Aldridge said. "Show the corridor running around the property," Clara said. "Northern boundary only. No impact on the ranch itself. Which means the county has no record of the ranch being in the acquisition zone. Which means Ethan Walker has never been formally notified that his land is subject to federal acquisition consideration," Clara said. "Which means every action Blackwood has taken to pressure him into selling the fence, cutting the well interference, the missing cattle has been conducted entirely outside any legal framework." "Private coercion," Aldridge said. "Facilitated by fraudulent survey documents filed with the county," Clara said. "Which is a federal crime because the survey is a federally chartered document." The silence in the room had a different quality now. It had weight. The weight of a case that was assembling itself in front of everyone present and had started to look like something that couldn't be undismantled. Aldridge sat back in his chair. He looked at Danny Pruitt. "Son," he said, "you said your father is the sheriff of Dust Creek." "Yes, sir," Danny said. "And you're prepared to testify about the conversations you described." Danny's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on his thighs. Clara watched him in her peripheral vision and didn't look directly at him, because this was his moment to get through in his own way. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's your father you'd be testifying about." "I know that," Danny said. Aldridge looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "All right," he said, and turned back to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to need you and Mr. Walker and these two young men to remain in Denver for at minimum 3 days while I verify these documents against our charter records and draft a federal complaint." He looked at Ethan. "The ranch." "My hands are there," Ethan said. "2 men. They can manage for a week." "Blackwood may move on the property while you're here." "Let him try," Ethan said, with a quietness that was not bravado, but something more like a man who has thought past the worst-case scenario and found that it doesn't frighten him the way it might have once. "If he does, that's more evidence." Aldridge almost smiled. "I'm also going to need you to write down everything you told me," he said to Clara. "In full. The ledger analysis, the payment, records, the Cole connection, the Cole brothers incident on the road." He looked at Peter. "And you're going to write down exactly how you came to be in possession of that letter and every detail you can recall about the circumstances." "Yes, sir," Peter said. "Can you write well enough to do that?" Peter Walsh sat up straight. "Miss Whitmore taught me," he said. "Sir." They spent 3 days in Denver. Aldridge put them up in a federal witness residence, which was a narrow townhouse 2 streets from the federal building with 3 bedrooms, and a woman named Ida, who made coffee at 6 in the morning and asked no questions, and had apparently seen enough federal witnesses over the years to take 2 children and a schoolteacher and a rancher entirely in stride. Clara wrote her account the first day. 14 pages, her clearest hand, every fact sourced, and annotated the ledger entries cited by page and line. She finished at 2 in the morning and went to sleep at the table and woke up when Ethan set a cup of coffee next to her elbow at 6. "You should have gone to bed," he said. "I wanted to finish it," she said. "It'll still be true tomorrow." "I know." She picked up the coffee. "I wanted to finish it while I could still feel every part of it clearly. Evidence gets softer around the edges if you wait too long. The urgency of it." He sat down across from her. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "The morning they put that notice on the schoolhouse door," she said. "I stood there and I read it 3 times, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I couldn't outrun." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Boston found me. The same pattern. Someone with power deciding I was useful until I became inconvenient." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought I'd done something wrong. Built something in the wrong place, that I had some I don't know, some quality that attracted this particular kind of trouble." Ethan was quiet listening. "I don't think that anymore," she said. What do you think now? She considered. I think I'm the kind of person who looks at numbers until they tell the truth, she said. And that there are always going to be people who find that inconvenient. And I think, she stopped. I think trying to be the kind of person who doesn't look is worse than whatever the looking costs me. He looked at her for a long moment. Miss Whitmore, he said. You could call me Clara, she said. We've been shot at by proxy and ridden 6 days through Wyoming together. I think we're past formalities. Something shifted in his face. The version of almost a smile that she'd learned to read as the real thing. Clara, he said, I think you might be the most certain person I've ever met. I'm not certain, she said. I'm just clear. What's the difference? Certain means you don't have doubts, she said. Clear means the doubts don't stop you. She looked at him. I have plenty of doubts, Mr. Walker. Ethan, he said. I have plenty of doubts, Ethan, she said. The name sat between them for a moment, simple and new. So do I, he said, for what it's worth. On the second day, Aldridge summoned them to the federal building. He had verified the survey records. He had cross-referenced the county land filings from Dust Creek against the charter documents. He had pulled the DPC Holdings corporate registration, which listed Victor Blackwood as a 30% equity partner, a fact that did not appear anywhere in the county's disclosure records for the Dust Creek Municipal Banking Authority, of which Blackwood was president. He's been operating as both buyer and regulatory authority over his own acquisition, Aldridge said. He used his bank position to create financial pressure on landowners, his county relationships to file fraudulent documents, and his DPC equity stake to profit directly from the acquisitions he was administering. He looked at the papers in front of him. This is not a local corruption case, Miss Whitmore. This is a federal conspiracy charge. The room was very quiet. What does that mean? Danny said, for my father. Aldridge looked at him. Your father accepted payments in connection with a federal investigation into his conduct, he said carefully. That's serious. How serious depends on the extent of his cooperation going forward. Danny nodded. His face was doing the thing it did when he was managing something large, going very still, very contained, like a vessel that was full and couldn't afford to slosh. If he cooperates, Clara said. If he cooperates. Aldridge confirmed. The U.S. Attorney's Office has considerable discretion in how they proceed. Danny looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at Ethan. Would you... He stopped. When this is over. When we go back. He looked away. He's going to need someone to tell him it's not too late. Ethan looked at the boy steadily. He's got you, he said. That's not nothing. Danny's jaw worked for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. The wire arrived on the third day. Aldridge received it in the morning and came to find them in the witness residence with the face of a man who has just been required to revise his plan significantly. Victor Blackwood left Dust Creek yesterday, he said, with 2 men. Our communication to the Wyoming Territorial Marshal's Office was apparently passed through channels that include at least one individual Blackwood has a relationship with. Clara felt the familiar cold move through her chest. He ran, she said. He knows we're here, Ethan said. He knows the case is in federal hands, Aldridge said. Yes, someone told him. His expression communicated what he thought about that without requiring him to say it. The marshal's office in Cheyenne has issued a detainment warrant, but Blackwood has a head start. Where would he go? Clara said. A man with his resources. Aldridge paused. Kansas City, Chicago. He has business connections in both. He has equity in DPC, Clara said suddenly. The railroad. If he reaches the main DPC corporate office... He can't use them, Aldridge said. We've already filed a federal hold on DPC's Wyoming operations pending investigation. Their legal team will not touch him. He's too much liability. He paused. But that doesn't mean he can't run. Clara thought about this. She thought about 64 children and a closed schoolhouse. She thought about Jim Morrison's well that dried up in March. She thought about 2 years of fence lines cut and cattle gone missing, and a boy named Danny who had ridden through the night because his father had become someone he didn't recognize. "He can't run far enough," she said. "Not with what we have." "No," Aldridge said. "He cannot." He looked at her steadily. "I want to assure you of that, Miss Whitmore. A federal conspiracy charge does not resolve itself on the say-so of the primary subject leaving the jurisdiction. The warrant follows him." "How long?" Ethan said. "The Marshall Network, weeks possibly. He will be found." Clara nodded. It wasn't the resolution she had imagined. She had imagined Blackwood in a room, listening to what had been built against him, understanding that it was over. She had imagined a moment, a definitive one. This was messier. This was the way real things ended, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in a series of legal mechanisms, grinding forward, each one slower and more certain than the last. She could live with that. She had learned to live with the way things actually were, rather than the way they looked in the telling. "What about the school?" she said. Aldridge looked at her. "The federal hold on DPC operations extends to any property acquired through the fraudulent county filings," he said, "including the school land. The notice on your schoolhouse door is effectively void pending the investigation." He paused. "Formally voiding it requires a territorial court order, which will take—" "How long?" Clara said. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. She thought about 3 weeks of children with nowhere to be. "Can I go back?" she said. "To Dust Creek. Can I go back and open the school while the order is being processed?" "The notice is not legally enforceable at this point," Aldridge said carefully. "I can't tell you to open the school. I can tell you that there is no current legal basis for the notice on that door." Clara understood exactly what he had not said. "Ethan," she said. He was already standing. "We leave in the morning," he said. They left in the morning. All 4 of them, Clara and Ethan and Danny and Peter, on the 4 horses they had, heading back through the territory they had come through north and west toward Wyoming. They were a day out of Denver when Ethan rode up beside Clara and said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "When this is over—" He stopped, started again. "The school is going to need to rebuild the annex fund, starting from nothing." "Yes," she said. "I want to contribute to it." She looked at him. "The eastern pasture land," he said. "Once the mineral rights are formally recorded, the value of the property increases. The rail company will have to compensate me properly for any easement. Federal law requires fair market valuation for mineral-bearing parcels." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "That's a significant amount of money, Clara. More than I need." "Ethan, I want the school to have the annex," he said. "I want those children to have the building you were trying to build." He paused. "And I want you to build it." She rode in silence for a moment. "That's not why I did any of this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm offering it." She thought about the shape of that, the thing he was saying underneath the words, the weight of it, the carefulness of a man who understood what it meant to offer something to someone and not want them to feel the obligation of it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. They rode on. The territory opened up ahead of them, vast and high, and lit at the edges by the afternoon sun, going gold against the rock faces of the distant hills. Clara felt it in her chest, the way she always felt. Open land, a kind of pressure that was not unpleasant, a reminder of scale, of how much there was, that was larger than any individual trouble or any individual person. She had arrived in Wyoming 3 years ago with 47 cents and a set of ledger books and a job that turned out to be a trap. She was going back to it now with evidence that had moved a federal commissioner to action with 2 boys who had proven themselves beyond their years, with the knowledge that a school that had been closed for a week was going to open again, and with something else, Something she was not ready to name yet, sitting beside her on a road horse with his hat pulled low and his eyes on the horizon, and his offer still hanging in the air between them like something that had been said aloud and could not be unsaid. She was going home. She wasn't entirely sure when Dust Creek had become home, or when home had started to include more than a schoolhouse and 64 students and a boarding house room with a widow's walk where she went to think. She thought she knew, though. She thought she knew exactly when. "Ethan," she said. He said. "Thank you," she said, "for walking through those saloon doors." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for not screaming." She laughed. It came out of her before she could moderate it, a real laugh, the kind that didn't ask permission first, and it startled Peter's horse slightly, and Peter said, "Whoa," and patted the animal's neck, and looked at them both with the expression of a 13-year-old who has decided that adults were mysterious, but perhaps not entirely incomprehensible. "She doesn't scream," Danny told him seriously. "I noticed," Peter said. Clara was still smiling when they crested the next hill, and Ethan Walker was not precisely smiling, but there was something in the lines of his face that hadn't been there 3 days ago, when they'd walked into a federal building with a satchel full of ledger books and everything riding on the arithmetic being right. The arithmetic had been right. It always was. They rode north through the gold afternoon, 4 of them together toward Wyoming, toward home. They rode into Dust Creek on a Thursday morning, 9 days after they had left it. The town looked the same. That was the first thing Clara noticed, and the thing that surprised her most, how entirely ordinary it appeared, how unchanged, as if nothing that had happened in the intervening 9 days had registered on the face of it at all. The same storefronts, the same boardwalk, the same water tower throwing the same shadow across the same stretch of Main Street. The schoolhouse door was still locked. The notice was still nailed to it. Clara looked at it from her horse and felt something tighten in her chest, and then deliberately release it. The notice was void. Aldridge had said so, legally unenforceable pending the federal order that was 2 weeks away. She got off her horse and walked to the door and pulled the notice off the nail. She folded it exactly as she had folded the first one 9 days ago and put it in her satchel next to the ledger books and the bank correspondence and the copy of Peter's letter and Jim Morrison's written statement. Then she reached into her coat pocket, past the 47 cents she still had not spent, and found her key. She unlocked the schoolhouse door. It swung open. The room was exactly as she had left it. The arithmetic papers still on her desk, waiting to be graded, the slates on the shelves, the primers stacked in the corner, the map of the United States on the wall with Wyoming territory, outlined in pencil, because the printed maps still hadn't caught up to statehood, and she'd drawn it in herself last September. She stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed. Then she turned around and looked at the street. There were people on the boardwalk. Some of the same people who had stood there 9 days ago and watched 2 men drag her into the Silver Spur. Ed Colton in front of the general store. Reverend Hayes outside the church. The barber with his towel. A dozen more she knew by name, and by the way they took their coffee, and by the names of their children. They were watching. Clara looked at them. "School opens tomorrow morning," she said, clearly carrying her voice the way she had learned to carry it in a room of 60 children who all wanted to be somewhere else. 8 o'clock. Tell your children." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Ed Colton's wife, a small woman named Ruth, who had never in 3 years said more than 10 words to Clara, in sequence came off the boardwalk and walked across the street and said, "Let me help you air it out." Clara looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I'd appreciate that." Word moved through Dust Creek the way word always moved through small towns, faster than it had any logical right to, carried by some invisible current that ran under the surface of ordinary daily life and surfaced everywhere at once. By noon, 3 families had come to the schoolhouse to ask questions. By mid-afternoon, there were 7 women in the room, helping Clara wash the slates and check the primer stock, and determine what needed to be ordered before the fall term started properly. Nobody mentioned the Silver Spur. Nobody mentioned Victor Blackwood by name. Clara let them not mention it. She understood the particular silence of people who were ashamed of themselves and were expressing it through action rather than language, and she had decided on the road back from Denver that this was good enough. It had to be good enough. She could not run a school in a town full of people she'd decided not to forgive. Forgiveness, she had concluded somewhere in southern Wyoming, was not the same as forgetting. It was just the decision to keep living in the same direction as the people who'd failed you, because the alternative was to stop moving entirely. She was not going to stop moving. Ethan had gone to his ranch. He'd said goodbye at the edge of town, with a brevity that was characteristic, a nod, a look, a quiet, "I'll be in touch," that contained more than it said, which was also characteristic. Danny had gone with him because the boy had nowhere else to go at the moment, and Ethan had said without ceremony, "You can stay at the bunkhouse until we sort out what comes next." And Danny had said, "Yes, sir," with the relief of a person who had been holding himself together for 9 days and needed somewhere to put it down. Peter Walsh's father had been waiting at the edge of town. A quiet man with work-worn hands and his son's same jaw, who had looked at Peter coming up the road with an expression that Clara recognized as the face of a parent who has spent 9 days imagining every worst outcome and is now trying to absorb the reality of the best one. He'd looked at Clara. "He came back safe," was all he said. "He did more than that," Clara said. "He was braver than most men I've known. You raised him well, Mr. Walsh." Peter's father had looked at his son and then away quickly, the way men did when something moved through them that they weren't prepared to express in public. "Come on home, son," he said, and Peter had gone with one look back at Clara that she would remember for a very long time. A look that said, "I know what we did, and it mattered, and I'm 13, and I'm going home for supper all at the same time." The first real problem came at dusk. Clara was locking the schoolhouse for the night when Sheriff Tom Pruitt came across the street. She heard his boots on the boardwalk before she saw him and turned to face him with her key still in her hand and her satchel on her shoulder, and she watched him come toward her and made a decision in the space of 3 steps about how this was going to go. She was not going to be the one to make it easy for him. He stopped 5 feet away. He was a big man running to soft now in the middle, with a face that had once been uncomplicated and was not anymore. He held his hat in his hands, which she hadn't expected. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff," she said. He looked at the open schoolhouse door, then at the hat in his hands. "My boy," he said. "Danny." "He's at Walker Ranch," she said. "He's fine." The relief that moved through the man's face was enormous and unguarded, and it told her something about him that the last 9 days had obscured. Whatever Tom Pruitt had become, whatever Blackwood had made of him, he had not stopped being Danny's father. "I know what he did," Tom Pruitt said. "Riding out like that. What he told you about—" He stopped. "About me." Clara waited. "Clara, he was right to," the sheriff said. It came out of him like something that had been held under pressure for a long time. "Everything he told you, it was right, and I—" He stopped again, looked at the hat. "I've been a coward, Miss Whitmore. I knew what Blackwood was doing, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, and then I told myself I didn't have enough evidence, and then I stopped looking for evidence because I knew I'd find it." His voice was flat and honest in the way of a man who has given up the softer version of a story about himself. "And that makes me—I don't know what that makes me." "It makes you a man who made bad choices," Clara said, "and who is standing here now instead of sitting in his office pretending he didn't." He looked at her. "The federal commissioner in Denver is going to want your cooperation," she said. "Full cooperation. Everything you know about the arrangement with Blackwood, every conversation, every paper you signed. It will need to be documented and sworn." "I know," he said. "And Judge Cole. I know about Cole," he said. "I'll tell them everything about Cole." "If you do that," Clara said carefully, "Commissioner Aldridge indicated the U.S. Attorney's Office has discretion in how they proceed with anyone who cooperates fully." She held his eyes. "I can't make you any promises, Sheriff, but I can tell you that what you do from this moment forward matters more than what you did before it." Tom Pruitt nodded. His jaw was working the same jaw Danny had the same set to it when he was managing something that cost him. "My boy," he said. "He's really all right." "He's better than all right," Clara said. "You should be proud of him." The sheriff put his hat back on, straightened it with both hands, the way a man does when he is putting himself back together in a visible way. "I'll go to the telegraph office in the morning," he said. "Wire Denver. Tell them I'm ready to make a statement." "Good," Clara said. He turned to go. "Sheriff," she said. He turned back. "Go see your son tonight," she said. "Walker Ranch is 3 miles out. He'll be in the bunkhouse." She paused. "He's been holding himself together for 9 days. He could probably use his father." Tom Pruitt stood there for a moment with an expression that was too complicated to name. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon he could." Victor Blackwood was found in Kansas City 11 days later. The news came by telegraph to Commissioner Aldridge's office in Denver, and Aldridge forwarded a copy to Clara at the schoolhouse through the Dust Creek telegraph office, and Clara read it standing at the counter while the operator pretended not to be watching her. Subject apprehended. Kansas City, Missouri, November 4th stop. Federal warrant executed. Stop extradition to Wyoming Territory. Pending stop. Additional charges being filed by U.S. Attorney Office, Denver. Stop Aldridge, TCO. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Outside the telegraph office, Main Street was doing what it always did. People moving horses, the sound of the blacksmith 2 streets over, a child's voice somewhere high and clear calling another child's name. The ordinary machinery of a town that was still standing. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let it settle into her. It was not a triumphant feeling. That surprised her. She had thought there would be something large and conclusive about this moment, something that matched the scale of what they had been through to reach it. What she felt instead was quieter. A kind of solidity. The feeling of something that had been held at an angle for a long time, returning to level. She walked back to the schoolhouse. The students were at their arithmetic. 2 weeks after that, the federal court order arrived from the territorial court in Cheyenne, formally invalidating every land document Victor Blackwood had filed through the county during his tenure as bank president. All forfeiture proceedings against any property in Dust Creek were suspended pending a full audit of the Municipal Banking Authority. The school fund was frozen at its current balance, which would have been nothing, except that 2 days after the news of Blackwood's arrest reached Dust Creek. Ed Colton had organized a collection among the Main Street businesses and presented Clara with an envelope containing $342 in cash and a handwritten note that said, "For the school. We're sorry we didn't do this sooner." Clara had accepted the envelope without saying anything about what it would have meant to have the town stand behind her 9 days earlier, because that was not what the moment called for. And she had learned was still learning the difference between the truth that needed to be said and the truth that needed to be held. She added the $342 to the school fund ledger on its own line in her clearest hand and wrote, "Community Contribution November" next to it, and let that be sufficient. The annex fund was a different matter. Ethan came to town on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after they'd returned, not because he was passing through, but specifically to come, which was different, and which Clara noticed. He brought Danny, who had spent the week since their return at Walker Ranch in what appeared to be a productive arrangement, working the ranch by day and writing letters to his father in the evenings. Letters that were long, and which Danny did not discuss, but which Clara suspected were doing the kind of work that neither of them could do in person yet. Tom Pruitt had wired Denver, had made his statement, had lost his position as sheriff, which was expected, and had not been criminally charged, which was also the result of a conversation Aldridge had had with the U.S. attorney that Clara would never know the full details of and did not need to. He was living in a room above the hardware store and working for Jim Hennessy, who ran the livery and had a reputation for giving work to men who needed a place to start over. Clara had seen him once from across the street, and they had not spoken, and that was, she thought, the right distance for now. Ethan sat across from her at the small table in the schoolroom after the children had gone home, with his hat on the table between them and the afternoon light coming through the west-facing window, and put a document on the table. Clara looked at it. It was a deed transfer document. The eastern pasture, the 60 acres of best grass, and the creek that didn't dry up in August, and the coal seam 4 years kept. Not the whole parcel, not the ownership, but an easement in favor of the Dust Creek School District, with a clause specifying that revenue from any future mineral extraction on the parcel was to be shared 40% with the school fund in perpetuity. She looked up at him. "The railroad easement negotiations settled last week," he said. "Federal fair market valuation for a mineral-bearing parcel. It was—" he paused. "Considerably more than I expected, even knowing what the land was worth." "Ethan." "I'm not giving the school my land," he said. "I'm giving it a share of what the land produces. That's different. The ranch stays mine." "I know that," she said. "That's not—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at the document. She looked at the clause. She looked at the phrase "in perpetuity," which was a legal word that meant forever, which was not a word that careful practical people used lightly. "Why?" she said. He looked at her in the direct, unhurried way he had. "Because I spent 7 years building something on that land," he said. "And you spent 3 years building something in this room, and those two things ought to—" He stopped, found the words. "They ought to be connected to each other, the way things in a place are supposed to be connected, the way a town is supposed to work." He paused. "And because those children deserve the building you were trying to build them, and I can do something about that, so I should." Clara looked at the document for a moment longer. Then she reached across the table and picked up the pen that was sitting in its stand at the edge of her desk and signed it. He didn't look surprised. He didn't perform relief. He just picked up the document and folded it and put it back in his coat, and that was the transaction, and it was done. "There's something else," he said. She waited. He reached into his coat again and set something on the table. Not a document this time. A small object wrapped in cloth, the kind of careful wrapping a man did when he was carrying something he didn't want to damage, but also wasn't sure how to present. Clara looked at it, then at him. "Open it," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a compass. Old, well-made brass gone warm with handling the kind of instrument that had been used and cared for over many years. The case had an engraving on the inside of the lid, initials EMW, and a date 1849. "My father's," Ethan said. "He carried it his whole life. Gave it to me when I left home at 17. He looked at it in her hands. "I've carried it for 18 years. Every cattle drive, every hard winter, every morning, I wasn't sure what direction I was supposed to be heading." Clara held the compass carefully. She could feel the weight of it, the particular weight of something that had been carried a long time. "Ethan," she said. "I want you to have it," he said. "Not because you need it. You've got better navigation instincts than anyone I've ever ridden with, and I mean that as high a compliment as I know how to give. But because—" He looked at her steadily, the way he always looked at her, with that quality of complete attention that had nothing in it of performance. "Because you always know which direction is right, Clara. You know it the way some people know north without a compass, just you know it. And I want you to have the compass as—" He stopped. "As what?" she said quietly. "As something from someone who sees that in you," he said, "and thinks it's the most remarkable thing he's ever encountered in a person." The schoolroom was very quiet. Clara held the compass and looked at it, and felt the weight of what he was saying under the words he was using, the careful architecture of a man who did not speak loosely, who meant exactly what he said, and only what he said, who had ridden 6 days through dangerous territory beside her, and asked nothing, and offered everything, and was now sitting across a schoolroom table, telling her in the precise and deliberate way he did all things, that she mattered to him in a way that went beyond the practical and the tactical and the useful. She closed her hand around the compass. "I'm going to stay in Dust Creek," she said. It came out more direct than she'd planned. "I thought you should know that. I'm not moving on. I'm staying." "I know," he said. I'm going to build the annex, and then I'm going to teach in it. I know, he said. And I'm going to keep the books exactly the way I keep them, she said, with no oversight except my own judgment because my judgment is good and I trust it. The corner of his mouth moved. Yes, he said. You should. And I'm going to be difficult sometimes, she said. I ask too many questions and I work too late, and I have strong opinions about the correct method of teaching long division, and apparently this makes some people uncomfortable. Does it? He said, and she heard in his voice the full version of the almost smile, the one that was usually just a fraction, and was now briefly whole. So I'm telling you, she said, in the interest of clear information. Clara, he said. Yes. I rode 6 days through Wyoming in November, he said. I know exactly who you are. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any of the silences that had preceded it. It had warmth in it. It had the particular quality of two people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side of it and are now sitting in the aftermath and finding that the aftermath is better than either of them had reason to expect. Danny's doing well, Ethan said after a moment. At the ranch. I know, she said. He came by the school yesterday, asked if he could sit in on the older student's reading lesson. Ethan looked at her. He reads at about a 9-year-old level, she said. He didn't want me to tell you that. He can't read well. He can read, she said. He just never had the time or the instruction to read well. His father, she paused. Some things got away from that family. She looked at the compass in her hand. I told him to come by every day at 4 o'clock. We'll work on it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He doesn't know about the coal yet, he said. The money. He doesn't need to know about the money, Clara said. He needs to know how to read. Yeah, Ethan said. You're right. She set the compass down on the table between them and looked at him. Have dinner with me, she said. Mrs. Garfield sets a table for 6, whether she has 6 people or not, and she has been feeding me sympathetically for 3 weeks, and I think she would be pleased to have someone other than herself to talk to. He looked at her. Is that a question or an instruction? He said. It's an invitation, she said. I thought you should know the difference. He picked up his hat from the table and put it on. All right, he said. Let's go. Mrs. Garfield was in fact very pleased. She set a table that went well beyond what was strictly necessary for 2 people, which Clara recognized as her particular form of welcome, the application of effort as affection. And she talked to Ethan about the state of his cattle and the condition of his fence line, and her late husband's opinion of the eastern pasture grazing land, which had apparently been extremely high, and which she conveyed with the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed having been right about something her husband had also been right about. Ethan listened and answered, and was in the particular way that Clara had come to expect from him completely present. He did not give the performance of listening. He actually listened. He asked 2 questions about Mrs. Garfield's husband that made the older woman's face go briefly soft, and then bright again, and Clara watched this happen and felt something in her chest settle into a place it had been trying to find for 3 years. After dinner on the porch with the town quiet around them and the cold coming in off the hills, Ethan stood beside her and looked at the street. The Blackwood Bank building, he said. Clara looked at it. The finest building on Main Street. 2 stories of imported brick with glass windows and a brass door handle. The federal audit will determine what happens to it, she said. The assets of the bank will be held pending the resolution of the criminal case. And after that, I don't know, she said. It depends on what's left once the creditors are sorted out. The town's going to need a bank, he said. A real one, with proper oversight. Yes, she said. Someone ought to set it up right, he said. She looked at him. Are you suggesting something? I'm observing that the town is going to need a person who understands accounts and has a demonstrated commitment to conducting them honestly, he said. and that such a person exists in Dust Creek and has demonstrated qualifications. "I'm a teacher," she said. "You're a teacher who was doing the bank's work for 3 years without the bank's title or the bank's pay," he said. "I'm just noting that the town might benefit from correcting that imbalance." Clara looked at the bank building. She thought about Boston, about the shipping company, about the ledgers she had kept and the questions she had asked and the cost of the asking. She thought about 47 cents still in her pocket, still there. "I'll think about it," she said, "after the annex is built." "That's fair," he said. They stood on the porch in the cold and the quiet, and she felt the weight of the compass in her coat pocket against her ribs next to the 47 cents, and she thought that this was perhaps the most she had ever carried in a coat pocket, and also that it was exactly the right amount. "Ethan," she said. "When you walked into the Silver Spur," she said, 9 days ago, you said you'd heard what I told Blackwood about the rail corridor. That sound carried." "Yes," he said, "but you also said you'd been standing out there a while." She looked at him. "Before I said anything about the corridor, before you had any reason to come in except that 2 men had dragged a woman inside and the street full of people wasn't doing anything about it." He was quiet. "So, which was it?" she said. "Was it the rail corridor, or was it—" "Both," he said. "In that order." "Which order?" He looked at her. "The rail corridor was the reason I told myself," he said. "After." Clara held that. "After?" she said. "After I'd already gone through the door," he said. The street was completely quiet now. One lamp burning outside the general store. The bank building dark. The sound of the wind coming through the gap between the livery and the hardware store, the way it always did in November. That particular high, thin sound that meant winter was close. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. "You asked," he said. "I always ask," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." She looked at him in the lamplight. This man who had built a life from bare ground, and kept a secret for 4 years out of patience, rather than fear, and ridden 6 days without complaint, and offered her the thing he'd carried since he was 17. And she thought about what it meant to find a person who told you the truth in the right order, the real reason first, even when it cost him something, and the practical reason second, offered honestly as what it was. She had been looking for clear information her whole life. She had found it in numbers in ledgers, in the clean precision of amounts that added up to what they were supposed to add up to. She had not expected to find it in a person. "It's cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You could stay," she said. "Mrs. Garfield has a room. She'll charge you 50 cents and make you breakfast." "Is that you being practical?" he said. "Or is that something else?" "It's both," she said. "In that order." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went inside to find Mrs. Garfield. Clara stood on the porch alone for 1 more minute and looked at the street. The school down the block unlocked now, the notice gone. The bank building dark and waiting to become something better. The whole town quiet under the November stars, holding its history and its failures and its capacity for something different. The way towns held things, not cleanly, not easily, but stubbornly. The way anything holds on when it has enough people in it who refuse to let go. She put her hand in her pocket and held the compass and the 47 cents together in her palm. She had arrived in Dust Creek with 47 cents and a set of ledger books and a position that turned out to be a trap. She was still here. She had a school and a signed easement document and a federal case moving through the courts and 64 children who were going to have an annex building with her name on the dedication if she had anything to say about it, which she did. She had a compass. She thought enough. The door opened behind her and Mrs. Garfield's voice came out into the cold, saying that if Clara Whitmore thought she was going to stand on a porch in November without a coat, she had another thing coming. And had she eaten enough at dinner because she hadn't looked like she'd eaten enough? Clara smiled and went inside. The door closed. The street was quiet. And in the morning, the school would open and the children would come and the work would continue. The way work continued when it was built on something true, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but forward, always forward, the needle of the compass finding north and holding there steady as anything she had ever counted on. Which it turned out was saying something.